Kids who live with a predatory mother become unconsciously preoccupied with reading their mother's moods. A fleeting glance, a furtive gesture, deceleration, and a shift of direction are signals of an approaching turn. Bracing, hiding, or merely holding on gives children a much-needed sense of control. Shutting down, avoiding eye contact, and getting away are other means of establishing control. Good morning and happy Super Bowl Sunday. I am so glad you're here. Today's video is going to really be about sort of a further extenuation of a video I made talking about the signs if you were raised by someone who had untreated and or undiagnosed borderline from the child perspective. I'm going to share some research, and then in my Substack, which I'll be releasing later today, it's really going to be video heavy on the newer research on BPD and understanding, what we think it, looks like, where it comes from, the roles or not that trauma plays. I just want to share some of the newer things with you there alongside the topics around splitting, because all of this can often apply to us in kind of subclinical ways. Even if we don't have borderline ourselves from our parents, we can have these parts of our brain that see the world through that lens because that has been our model. And don't forget that most often BPD has those who struggle often have a more disorganized attachment system, which means that they were both the source of safety, the caregiver, and also often our source of fear, leaving us with a sort of unresolvable, almost impossible dilemma. How do I go towards and away from the same person for protection who also harms me in some way, mentally, physically, and or emotionally? So in the Substack, I'm going to share a bunch of research, some newer research, and even I'm going to share a video, it's going to be video heavy this week, on a couple pages of the core wounds that I believe are common among us when we're raised by parents with undiagnosed borderline and narcissism. And this is a course that I really built from the years of patients I've seen, from my own experience, and through lots of research. So check those out too. So let's talk, though, about some current stuff. There's a research article I'll link down below, and it was looking at borderline moms with borderline, and their 3-year-old children. And it talked about kind of how their kids can struggle. And really quickly, when you think about borderline, you are really thinking about a dynamic where there's a lot of emotional and relational and mental kind of high highs and low lows and instability. The hallmarks are, of course, a fear of abandonment, impulsivity, it can be self-harm or not. But at the core, we're talking about a lot of inconsistency, a lot of emotional dysregulation, and as a result of that, it can make, obviously, something like parenting quite difficult. Also, quick reminder, if you believe you are highly masking autistic and or you have been diagnosed with borderline and you have any traits of autism, please consider an autism screening, especially if you've been diagnosed with BPD, because some research is showing that many people have been misdiagnosed. Instead of seen as autistic, they've been labeled and also treated through the lens of BPD. All right, so some research has said that in many cases when we have moms like this, we often have a long-lasting difficulty maintaining healthy relationships, which makes sense, right? Both from the attachment wounds and the modeling, we might not know how to do that. We might be stuck in our own reenactments trying to heal these mother wounds or parent wounds. I believe both of my parents had BPD. It just looked very different. And so also it talks about, the research says that the interpersonal and emotional dysregulation difficulties of the caregiver with borderline are often absorbed by the infant. And research shows that those with borderline, for example, have higher risk of things like cardiovascular issues, strokes, and that something like parenting can actually really increase the stress load. And we know that managing stress and not managing it well often creates toxic stress and increases our lifetime stress when we get stuck in those really not great coping mechanisms. So it makes sense that parenting would add, for so many reasons, interpersonal, behavioral, relational triggers for those who are struggling. Even when we don't have BPD, parenting, I believe, has those things, right? It says that children of mothers with BPD often mirrored their caregiver's distress, dependence on others, and fears of abandonment and rejection, which can make relationships with them at times intense and overwhelming. So I'm going to approach this from myself as a person who I do not believe has BPD, but definitely has a lot of these qualities that were really born out of trying to find my best ways to navigate my mom. And lastly, I will say that My mom honestly was the worst to me from the time I got married until I was 50. So, yes, there was lots of stuff in childhood and anger and dysregulation, but honestly, the hardest parts for me came well into my adult life. And I have since then worked with so many patients who are still very much trapped in these adult relationships because they're afraid to extricate, set boundaries, and things like that. And then lastly, it says that unsurprisingly, the early experiences of those with borderline often parallel the experiences of their children. So there can be a lot of, they had trauma and now they're unfortunately creating trauma through their dysregulation, many of their challenges and things like that. And that it says, even with the best of intentions, moms with BPD who felt needy themselves often had difficulty meeting their own infants' needs, and they are at greater risk of repeating the patterns of their own upbringing with their own children, like I just said. And as a result of that, and given these, I believe, very pervasive challenges, that obviously things like early intervention and treatment can be very helpful. And I will say that unlike narcissism for borderline, number one, we have many effective treatments. There's not just one, there are multiple. And that when they are motivated to seek help, it tends to be pretty successful. And so that's the key difference. If you're dragging your mom with BPD or narcissism into a therapy session who does not want to be there and doesn't believe it's their problem, it's probably not going to go well. For example, my mom walked out on a therapist multiple times when we tried, back in my 30s, trying to resolve these relationships. And one more thing I will say is if you have a parent like this on any level of immaturity, emotionally, BPD, NPD, whatever, most of us do not walk into no contact easily. It is one of the hardest things we ever do, but it is because we have tried endlessly to try to solve these relationships. Nobody wants to be disconnected, but sometimes it is the healthiest thing you can do. Ideally, you start with setting boundaries, as I've talked about, and many of those with borderline will respond because they don't want to lose you, but many will not. And so then you have to decide, where the level of harm is for you and where you're going to protect yourself or not, or how you're going to try to protect yourself. So these are 14 signs. I know they're a lot, but it's really important, I believe, if you resonate with these, to look at how they might show up in your life. And lastly, you will find, and I'm going to share, that if you have something like high masking autism, and maybe your mom or dad or caregiver did too, you might look at these signs from an even more layered lens about how we thought it was this thing, but maybe it was a combination of like your brain and the trauma you were experiencing. Number one, hypervigilance. As I've talked about, hypervigilance is meant to protect us and keep us safe, and we need it. But when it becomes chronic, it is almost like you're lurking around and looking and scanning for danger through people's facial expressions and body language, and everything means something. And as a result, you can get stuck. And I just found another research article on autism and social issues for us, that because we become hypervigilant to rejection, we're almost scanning for it. And we can get stuck in a negative loop. Oh, I know that's coming. And look how her face looks like she's mad at me. And I knew it, things like that. But at the core of this hypervigilant dynamic is that all of our emotional safety was always outsourced to our caregiver. If mommy's happy, I'm okay. If daddy's happy or parent is okay, I'm okay. And we often don't learn to insource, what I call insource. So we're always outsourcing. I'm only okay when everyone else is okay. And we don't know how to be okay without looking to others' moods and minds. And so learning how to set boundaries, do resetting nervous system techniques, separating, enmeshment work, all of that important. Number two, deep inside what they tell us, we believe the bad stuff. Example, my mom might say, I'm so proud of you, but she'd also call me a POS or accuse me of terrible things. And so as a result of that splitting, maybe she was valuing me and then devaluing me or idealizing me, we hold on to the negative. So you will notice that no matter how we mask with confidence or whatever, until we work on it, deep inside there's a wound that says, I really am all the bad things you've said, spoiled, selfish, ungrateful, a POS, whatever. So those cycles can continue and be really hard for us to fully believe anything truly good about ourselves. Number three, we're often afraid to take chances. The world is scary and big when an adult's big emotions determine everything. We don't want to make mistakes. We want to be perfect. And so we might keep ourselves small until, over time we learn not to do that. Number 4 is we're often both little, and I'll use my own self, a little girl and a grown woman. And when you think about coming out of the womb, having a caregiver who basically made you a caretaker of them, even when you were a child, you were sort of like an adult. As I've talked about, I came out of the womb as a 30-year-old adult, smoking a cigarette. And also I've been historically felt very childlike inside. Not so much in like creating change in my world, but until I did this work about 7 years ago, really deep work on my mom stuff, I always felt like I could never, and I've struggled with that. Can I really provide for myself? Even though I had all these markers of success, this fear was like, but I can't, I'm too small inside, or I'm not safe enough as a big girl to do that. That's kind of what it feels like. And the last part of that is identity is really a big piece of the research talks about us not really knowing who we are because we've only existed in response to meeting a caregiver's needs. So our dreams, our goals, our hopes, whatever, might often be deeply buried until we access them. The next one is there's a never-ending mother wound. And it's because you never, even though they can be so great sometimes, not all of them, but many of them can be. And this is the piece I've noticed that makes therapy so difficult, is that most parents are not bad all the time. And so we have these great moments with them, or they're helpful or loving or whatever, but then they're also so harmful. And so as a result, there's this longing for like a safe mother that we'll never truly have. Maybe you were lucky to have a grandparent or step-parent or pseudo-parent who helped heal that. But for many of us, there's just this emptiness inside and a space where a mother really should be because we never had that full embodied safe experience. The next one is we're often afraid of conflict and afraid of anger, and therefore we don't self-advocate. If anything looks or smells like a feeling that might make someone upset, and our primary caregiver made our house, made us walk on eggshells because when they were upset, no one was safe. That's the outsourcing. Then deep inside, we're not going to do anything. So it took me so many years to even stand up for myself. And frankly, I still don't like it, but I'm way better than I was. And unfortunately, what helped me the most was, and I wish it wasn't this, was being in a high conflict divorce, having almost full custody and still having fears and having to go into these horrific situations. Family court is the absolute worst place on the planet. And your lawyer can say anything they want. By the way, going back to the Justin and Blake stuff, you can write anything you want about anyone in a brief. And so it doesn't have to be true. But that feels terrible to have someone accuse you of things that you didn't do, especially if it's a reenactment. Let's say you married a narcissist or someone who was traumatizing, who is really reenacting the same thing your parents said and did to you. So there can be layers of that. But the bottom line is that learning to advocate is incredibly important, and you are entitled to it and worthy of it. The next one is that we're often always confused. And the research talks a lot about childhood maltreatment and confusion being very common. Going back to that whole, the source of safety is also the source of fear. It's confusing. How can you tell me you're proud of me but also call me a POS? How can you say you love me? As my therapist said, is that really love? I would say, well, I know she loves me, but it's like, well, is that what love is supposed to look and feel like? I do believe that they feel it, but they don't know how to share that healthy expression of love. So you just are always scratching your head because in these highly invalidating environments, and that is what defines often borderline homes with parents who struggle, is that you're never really seen for who you are. And so it's always like, well, do you see me or do you not? How do I get seen? And things like that. The next one is we often have, and the research shows with adverse childhood experiences, chronic illness, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, IBS, all kinds of things. And so we really can struggle, but especially if it's like a low grade thing where no one really sees it, or like for most autoimmune, it takes 7 years to get diagnosed. You just feel like, oh my God, what is wrong with me? I can't do this. I don't feel well. And that can certainly be a combination of your physical and mental health together. But clearly often the chronic stress takes its toll, and you often have significantly important underlying conditions of chronic illness. The next one is control issues. The research talks about many of the children of borderline moms in these clinical populations, even 20 years ago, were bossier and things like that. And as I thought about autism, I thought, well, I wonder if, in part, yes, we had no control, but also we're trying to really manage our overstimulation, our sensory issues. A parent who's struggling isn't necessarily going to do a good job of trying to provide general consistency. In fact, a parent with mental health issues is going to often create instability. And I believe instability stability is incredibly damaging. And so things like that. Role reversal, enmeshment, parentification, all of these things where no one is the role they're supposed to be was how it was. Going back to being both, you're a child, don't tell me what to do, and then mommy me, as the parent might say to you. You know, they're dumping their problems on you at 12, asking you to talk about their marriage or be a mediator, and talking about their husband or wife or whatever. And then they're turning around and saying, you're a child, what do you know? It's like very confusing. So that can be a problem because you don't really know what your role is, or you think it's your role to caretake everyone because that's the role reversal you grew up in. In fact, compulsive caretaking is extremely common among those of us with moms or parents with BPD or narcissism, and also, any kind of trauma where we basically had to, act in these dual roles. The next one is we're often overly empathic. We go out of our way to not be them, to not be rude to the waiter or disrespectful or unkind or cruel. But as a result, this is a trauma response of same thing, compulsive caretaking, being so good, being okay, being chill, whatever it is, we don't want to be them. And we know that too much of that is also harmful for us, not just for absorbing it, but for not setting boundaries. And when we're doing that, we're inherently neglecting ourselves. Number 12, trust issues. It makes sense, of course, and the research is very clear here, that when your primary caregiver is not generally, not perfectly, consistent and reliable, why would I trust anyone, right? And so that can play out in trusting yourself or not trusting others and things like that. I found that I've always could trust myself, but trusting other people has been a huge challenge. The last two are, as a result of these kind of parent struggles, their whole life, you feel responsible for them, and almost like you're always like reading the tea leaves or their mind, or it's like you have a scanning virus all of the time for their unhappiness, whatever's going on with them. Even when I was in no contact intermittently, I was always thinking about her and worried about her. And as I recently shared, I found out she has blood cancer and I'm still stressed about it, but not in the same way I was when I was in that everyday, really toxic relationship. And lastly, as a result, because they couldn't do it, we can have our own poor solutions to managing our own stress. So navigating our nervous system, using substances, overworking, constantly trying to change things or being impulsive, whatever it is, and not really learning how to just sit in taking care of ourselves and not even believing we're worthy of it, let alone even knowing how to do it. So those are important. And then how do we heal with this? Of course, things like dealing with that relationship is so important. Number one, you cannot, as I've said a million times, you cannot come to therapy. You can, but talk about your mom the entire session and then get in the car and call her on the way home. If you know that's going to be a negative experience. Many of those with borderline are really good, and any mental health issue can be really good at negativity. We are as humans. And that can be a bonding glue. My mom was great when I was unhappy. And any friend or someone who's in that space is good for that. But then the research also shows that just talking about it and dumping it doesn't necessarily always help you. It can be, but in the loop, I would argue you're just hang up feeling worse. Yeah, someone heard you, but it's all negative and worst case scenario. So boundary issues, setting boundaries, grieving, so much grieving work, grieving the mother you'll never have, grieving the one you always hope for, all of that. Remothering yourself. You are, as I've said in so many places too, your inner parent and your inner child. And so learning how to, with compassion and love and healthy boundaries, do that work. In fact, I have a course on that. And lastly, trauma therapy, all of that can be helpful. Parts work, all of those things can be incredibly helpful. So as I said on my Substack, I will be sharing more borderline information on research and some of the newer things that we're learning, and also 2 pages from my course that I created so many years ago on being raised by truly parents who probably have some form of borderline and or narcissism, and the unique and just so devastating way that can harm you and hurt you in a world that often I think doesn't understand that. And so, because especially with something like, these personality dynamics, they usually don't change over the course of someone's life unless they're doing the work. And especially in these older generations, I will say that for many reasons, it just seems like many of my clients who have, I'm not saying this is true for all, but many boomer parents are just not interested in even looking at their side of the street, let alone working on a treatment or getting therapy. And obviously, that can make a huge difference. The research is very clear on that. And so, anyway, that is it for today's video. I hope you will join me on Substack. And like I said, this week's video or this week's newsletter will be kind of like video heavy, but everything from pop culture to recipes on, working on your chronic health issues, to autism and trauma, and my favorite, the art of isolation. Although I'm not doing that today because my house is full. It's way fuller than it was recently, as I've shared, and we'll be watching the game too. So anyway, have a beautiful day. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you soon. Oh, really quickly, on Tuesday, I'm going to share a video about the impacts of undiagnosed autism and why it can be so profoundly important to look at those symptoms and how they've affected your life, to work on healing and loving yourself and kind of crafting a new path moving forward. So that's it. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.